A small plane is flying low over the mountains of central Idaho, and something falls out of it. A wooden box, tumbling through the air. A parachute snaps open above it, and the box swings and drifts down toward a valley, with no roads, no trails, and no people in it. It hits the ground, and the moment it lands, the sides fall open on their own. And out of the box, blinking in the daylight, walks a live beaver. Then another plane pass, and another box, and another parachute, and another beaver, and another. 76 of them dropped out of the sky into one of the most remote pieces of wilderness in the United States. This is not a joke, and it is not a legend. It was a deliberate government wildlife program, planned and carried out by the state of Idaho in 1948, complete with an official report and a film crew. And the strangest part is not the parachutes. It is what those animals did after they landed. Because over the following decades, in a valley almost nobody ever visited, those beavers built something that scientists today are studying as a survival tool against wildfire and drought, and that you can pick out from the air across miles of mountain country. The trouble started, as it usually does, with people and animals wanting the same piece of ground. After the Second World War, the area around a town called McCall in central Idaho was growing fast. Soldiers were coming home, land was being cleared, orchards and irrigated fields and new houses were spreading out along the valley bottoms. And valley bottoms, with their slow streams and soft banks and young willows, are exactly where beavers want to live. So the beavers did what beavers do. They dammed the streams and the irrigation ditches. They flooded fields. They dropped trees into orchards. They plugged culverts and backed water up over roads. To a farmer who had just cleared and planted a piece of land, a beaver colony moving in was not charming wildlife. It was a machine that arrived overnight and rearranged the water on the property. The Idaho Department of Fish and Game was caught in the middle. Beavers were valuable, both as wildlife and as an animal that had been trapped almost out of existence across much of North America during the fur trade. Killing them all off around McCall was not the goal. The obvious answer was to move them somewhere they would be useful instead of destructive, and there was a perfect place for that, a huge, empty, roadless expanse of mountain wilderness in the Chamberlain Basin, well to the east, full of streams that could use beavers, and containing almost no people to be bothered by them. The only problem was getting them there. Moving a beaver is much harder than it sounds. A beaver is a heavy, powerful animal that overheats easily. It is built for cold water and cool burrows, and it does badly in the heat. In the 1940s, moving one into deep backcountry meant loading it into a container, putting the container on a horse or a mule, and walking it in over mountain passes. That took days. The beavers would sit in the sun in a box, getting hotter and more stressed with every mile, and a lot of them simply did not survive the journey. The ones that did arrive were often in poor condition, which is a terrible way to start a new colony. The mules were not happy about it either. Pack animals disliked carrying live beavers, which are noisy and smell like a wild animal, and an agitated mule on a narrow mountain trail is a serious problem for everyone involved. The whole operation was expensive, slow, and produced dead beavers at the end of it. An officer with Idaho Fish and Game named Elmo Heter looked at this and asked a question that only made sense in that exact moment in history. What if the beavers did not need to go over the mountains at all? What if they went over them? Because in 1948, one thing the United States had in enormous surplus was parachutes. The war had just ended, and military equipment was everywhere, cheap and available, including large numbers of used cargo parachutes with no war left to use them in. So Heter set out to solve the real engineering problem, which was not the parachute, it was the box. He needed a container that would hold a beaver securely through the flight, survive the drop, and then open by itself on landing, because there would be nobody down there to open it. And the animal inside was a rodent whose entire profession is chewing through wood. His first attempt used woven willow, which seemed appropriately natural, and the beavers dealt with it exactly the way you would expect. They chewed their way out, which is fine on the ground and catastrophic at altitude. So he built a wooden box instead, hinged so that the sides would swing open when the tension came off the rigging as it hit the ground. The design had to be strong enough to contain a determined beaver, light enough to drop, and reliable enough to open on impact without help. Then it had to be tested, and this is where the story acquires its most famous character. The test beaver was an older male, and the crew named him Geronimo. Geronimo was dropped again and again, loaded into the box, taken up, released, floated down, landed, and released, then collected and taken up to do it again. By the accounts of the people involved, he got so used to the routine that when they approached him after a landing, he would climb back toward the box on his own. He absorbed test drop after test drop, while the design was refined, an old beaver falling out of Idaho skies over and over in the name of engineering. And when the testing was finally finished, Geronimo went out on the real operation, dropped into the wilderness for good, and the crew sent 3 young females down with him. Then came the actual program. In the autumn of 1948, Idaho Fish and Game loaded up beavers from the conflict areas and flew them east into the backcountry. 76 beavers went out the door of an airplane under parachutes and came down into the Chamberlain Basin. 75 of them survived the trip. The one death was almost the worst possible version of a beaver accident. Its box came open too early, while it was still in the air, and the animal fell. Everything else worked. Boxes opened on landing, beavers walked out, and in a valley that took days to reach on foot, an entire founding population of dam builders arrived from the sky in a single afternoon of flying, at a fraction of what the mule trains had been costing. Heter wrote the whole thing up formally and published it in a scientific journal a couple of years later, complete with diagrams of the box, which is why we know the details rather than just the tall tale. A film crew also recorded it. And then, in a very human twist, the footage was misfiled in the state archives and effectively lost for decades. People kept telling the story of the parachuting beavers, and it kept sounding more and more like folklore until archivists at Idaho Fish and Game rediscovered the original film in 2015. It is real. You can watch the boxes leave the plane and the parachutes open. So a strange, funny, slightly ridiculous thing happened in 1948. That alone would be a good story. But it is the part almost nobody tells that actually matters, because what those animals were dropped into that valley to do turned out to be far more valuable than anyone in 1948 understood. And if stories about the wild doing things nobody predicted are what you came for, take a moment to subscribe, because what those beavers built out there is now being studied as a defense against something the men flying that plane never imagined. A beaver dam is not really a wall. It is a machine for changing how water behaves. When beavers dam a stream, the water backs up into a pond. That pond spreads out sideways across the valley floor, instead of racing straight down the channel. Water that would have run off the mountain in a few days is held. Some of it soaks down into the ground, raising the water table across the whole surrounding area. Sediment settles out in the still water instead of scouring downstream. Side channels form. Wet meadows spread out around the ponds. Willows and other water-loving plants explode along the edges, which gives the beavers more food and more building material, which lets them build more dams, which holds more water. One colony does this to one stretch of stream, but beavers spread. Young beavers leave home and move upstream and downstream to found their own colonies, and over years and decades, a founding population can work its way through an entire drainage, dam after dam, pond after pond, until a fast, narrow, cut-down stream becomes a stepped chain of ponds and wetlands stretching for miles. That is what those 76 animals were sent into the Chamberlain Basin to start. And in a wilderness with essentially no people in it, no roads, no farms, and nobody removing dams, that is exactly the kind of place where beavers are free to do it at full scale for generations. Now here is why scientists care about that in a way they simply did not in 1948. Wetlands built by beavers hold water in the landscape through the dry season. In a mountain country where the snow melts in spring and the streams can shrink badly by late summer, that stored water keeps creeks flowing, keeps meadows green, and keeps cold water pools available for fish when everything else is drying out. Young trout and salmon use beaver ponds as nurseries. Moose, waterfowl, amphibians, and birds pile into the habitat that appears around them. A beaver complex is one of the richest things that can happen to a mountain stream. And then there is fire. Central Idaho burns. It always has. Large wildfires move through this country regularly, and the Chamberlain Basin sits inside an enormous wilderness area that has seen a great deal of fire over the decades since those beavers landed. What researchers have found in recent years, studying beaver complexes across the western United States, is that the wet corridors beavers create behave very differently when fire arrives. The ground is saturated. The vegetation is full of water. Instead of burning through, fire tends to skirt or weaken around these areas, leaving green strips of living habitat running through burned country. Work published in recent years has shown these beaver-maintained corridors staying strikingly intact while the land around them was scorched, acting as refuges where animals and plants survive the fire and recolonize afterward. Nobody in 1948 was thinking about fire refuges or climate resilience. They were thinking about angry farmers and dead mules. But the animals they parachuted into the mountains went on building the exact kind of wet, stubborn, fire-resistant landscape that people are now trying, at great expense, to recreate deliberately. Today, restoration crews across the American West build what are called beaver dam analogs, artificial structures made of posts and woven branches, specifically to imitate what a beaver does, in the hope of attracting real beavers to move in and take over the work. We are now paying people to build bad copies of the thing those 76 animals were doing for free. It is worth being honest about the limits of this story, because it gets retold with a lot of enthusiasm and not much precision. Nobody put tracking devices on those beavers. There was no long-term monitoring program following the descendants of the animals dropped in 1948. The Chamberlain Basin today is full of beaver country, and the drop is a real documented part of how beavers came back to that landscape. But pointing at a specific pond and saying that exact dam traces to a specific parachute in 1948 is not something anyone can prove. What can be said is that a founding population was placed into excellent, undisturbed habitat, and that beavers thrive there now. Relocating beavers is also not a guaranteed success anywhere. Moved beavers often wander, sometimes for long distances, looking for the right water. Some die, some end up back in conflict with people. Relocation works when the destination genuinely suits them and when they are moved as family groups rather than lone animals, and it fails often enough that it is treated as a careful management tool, not a simple fix. And beavers really do cause problems. That was the whole reason for the airlift in the first place. They flood roads, plug culverts, drown crops, and take down valuable trees. And for the people dealing with that, a beaver colony is a genuine expense and not a heartwarming story. Modern management often uses devices that let water through a dam quietly, so a colony can stay where it is without flooding a road, precisely because the goal is usually to live with beavers rather than to remove them. None of that disappears because the animals are ecologically valuable. But the core of it holds, and it is remarkable. A state wildlife agency, faced with a nuisance animal and a transport problem, used leftover war parachutes to airdrop 76 beavers into a roadless wilderness, lost only one, and in doing so, seeded a landscape with the most effective natural water engineers on the continent. The men who did it thought they were solving a logistics headache. They were also, without knowing it, installing a system that would go on storing water, growing wetlands, sheltering fish, and standing up to wildfire for longer than any of them would live. Somewhere over central Idaho in the autumn of 1948, a wooden box fell out of an airplane. A parachute opened, and an animal that had never seen the sky from that angle came down into a valley it had not chosen. It walked out of the box into a stream it did not know, and it started doing the only thing it knew how to do: cut wood, stack it, slow the water down. 76 times over, and the mountains are still holding the water. If you enjoy true stories from the strange edges of conservation, stories most people never hear, then like this video and subscribe. In the next one, we will follow another place the world had already given up on. Take care of yourself and stay curious.